What was the biggest secret your family kept from you? I found out I was kidnapped when I was 26 years old through a DNA test I took on a whim because my girlfriend thought it would be fun to see our ancestry results. The email came at 9:43 a.m. on a Monday morning while I was drinking coffee at my desk, a notification from the testing company saying I had a close family match. I clicked through expecting maybe a distant cousin, and instead found a match labeled as parent-child relationship with a woman named Carol Whitfield, who lived in Oregon. My hands went completely numb around my coffee mug. Both my parents were alive and living 20 minutes away in the Denver suburb where I'd grown up. My mother's name was Linda Chambers. My father was Robert Chambers. I'd never heard of anyone named Carol Whitfield. But according to the DNA analysis, she shared 50% of my genetic material, which meant she was either my mother or my daughter. Since I'd never had kids, the math pointed to only one impossible conclusion. I'd been living what I thought was a completely normal life in Denver, working as a graphic designer for a marketing firm, dating my girlfriend Alexis for about 8 months, seeing my parents for dinner every few weeks. I was an only child, born in 1998 according to my birth certificate, raised in a middle-class household by parents who seemed loving, if somewhat overprotective. My childhood had been unremarkable in the best way. Little league baseball, family vacations to national parks, birthday parties with neighbors, a golden retriever named Buster. My parents, Robert and Linda, were both accountants who'd met in college and married young. They'd always told me I was their miracle baby, that my mother had struggled with fertility issues for years before finally getting pregnant with me. I'd accepted this story without question because, why wouldn't I? Parents don't lie about fundamental things like where their children come from. Except apparently mine had. I stared at the DNA match on my screen, reading the details over and over. Carol Whitfield, age 51, location Portland, Oregon, parent-child relationship confidence 99.9%. There was a message option to contact her. My finger hovered over it, but I couldn't make myself click. Instead, I called my mother from my office, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone twice. She answered cheerfully and said, "Hi, honey, what's up?" I said, "I need to ask you something and I need you to be completely honest with me." Her tone shifted immediately. She said, "What's wrong? You sound upset." I said, "I took a DNA test and it says I have a genetic mother in Oregon named Carol Whitfield. Who is that?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched out for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 seconds. Then my mother said in a voice I'd never heard before, "Where are you right now?" I said I was at work. She said, "Don't go anywhere. Don't contact anyone. Your father and I are coming to get you right now. We need to talk in person." The 45 minutes it took my parents to drive to my office were the longest of my life. I sat at my desk pretending to work while my mind spiraled through increasingly bizarre explanations. Maybe I was adopted and my parents had never told me. Maybe there was some kind of mix-up at the hospital when I was born. Maybe Carol Whitfield was my biological mother who'd given me up and my parents had raised me without explaining the adoption. But none of those explanations accounted for the edge of panic I'd heard in my mother's voice or her insistence that I not contact anyone. When my parents finally arrived, they looked terrible. My mother's face was blotchy and red like she'd been crying. My father's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching. They asked my supervisor if they could use a conference room for a private family matter. We sat down in the small glass-walled room, and my father said, "What exactly did the DNA test tell you?" I showed them my phone with the match to Carol Whitfield. My mother made a sound like she'd been punched in the stomach. My father put his head in his hands. Then my mother said, "We always knew this day might come. We hoped it wouldn't, but we knew it was possible." I said, "What day? What are you talking about?" My father looked up and said, "We need to tell you the truth, but first you need to understand that everything we did because we love you. We've loved you since the moment we brought you home. You're our son in every way that matters." I said, "Brought me home from where?" My mother started crying and said, "From Florida, when you were 3 years old. We took you from a playground while your mother, your biological mother, was distracted. We changed your name and moved across the country and raised you as our own." The words didn't make sense. I heard them, but my brain refused to process them into meaning. I said, "You're saying you kidnapped me?" My father said, "We prefer to think of it as rescuing you. But yes, technically, that's what happened." The room tilted sideways. I gripped the edge of the conference table to keep myself upright. I said, "This is insane. This can't be real. You're my parents. I have a birth certificate. I have baby pictures." My mother said, "The birth certificate is fake. The baby pictures are real, but they start when you were 3, not as a newborn. If you look closely at our family photos, you'll notice there are no pictures of you as an infant. We couldn't fabricate those without raising questions." I thought back to our family photo albums and realized she was right. All my childhood photos started around age 3 or 4. I'd never questioned it because there were so many photos after that, so much documented evidence of my childhood, that a missing year or two hadn't seemed significant. Now it felt like the foundation of my entire life was crumbling. I said, "Why? Why would you do this?" My father said, "We couldn't have children of our own. We tried for years. Fertility treatments, adoption applications, everything. We were desperate. And then we saw you at that playground in Florida, and you were so perfect, and your mother wasn't paying attention, and we took you. We got in our car and drove away and never looked back. I couldn't breathe. The conference room felt like it was closing in on me. I said, "So my real name isn't even Daniel Chambers?" My mother said, "Your original name was Benjamin Whitfield. You were 3 years old when we took you. Young enough that you didn't have strong memories of your life before, young enough that you adapted to your new identity relatively quickly. We called you Daniel and told you that's who you'd always been, and eventually you believed it." I said, "And Carol Whitfield?" My father said, "Your biological mother. She's been searching for you for 23 years. I stood up so fast my chair fell backward. I said, "You stole me from my mother and let her spend 2 decades thinking I was dead or worse? What kind of people are you?" My mother reached for me and said, "We're people who loved you desperately and made a terrible choice. We know it was wrong. We've known it was wrong every day for 23 years. But we couldn't give you back. You were ours. You are ours." I backed away from her and said, "I need to get out of here. I need to think." I left my parents in that conference room and walked out of the office building into the parking lot. I got in my car and just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd just learned. My entire identity was a lie. My name was a lie. My birth certificate was a lie. My parents weren't my parents. They were kidnappers who'd stolen someone else's child and raised him as their own. And somewhere in Oregon was a woman who'd spent 23 years searching for her missing son, probably assuming he was dead, never knowing he was alive and well and living under a different name in Colorado. I pulled out my phone and looked at the DNA match again. There was a message option. I clicked it and started typing. "My name is Daniel Chambers, but apparently it used to be Benjamin Whitfield. I just found out today that the people I thought were my parents kidnapped me when I was 3 years old. I don't know what to do. I'm so sorry for what happened to you." I hit send before I could second guess it. Within 10 minutes, my phone rang with an Oregon area code. I answered and heard a woman's voice, trembling and hopeful and desperate. She said, "Benjamin, is it really you?" I said, "I don't know. Maybe? I'm very confused right now." The woman, Carol, said, "I've been looking for you for 23 years. You disappeared from a playground in Tampa on a Saturday afternoon in March. 1 minute you were playing on the swings, the next minute you were gone. I filed police reports, hired private investigators, appeared on missing children's shows, never gave up hope. And now you're calling me, and I don't know if this is real or if I'm dreaming." I said, "It's real. I took a DNA test, and it matched to you." Then I confronted my parents, the people who raised me, and they admitted they took me from Florida when I was 3. Carol made a sound between a sob and a laugh and said, "I need to see you. I need to see my son. Can you come to Portland? Or I can come to Denver. Whatever works. I just need to see you with my own eyes." If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. I told Carol I needed some time to process everything, but I'd contact her soon. Then I called the only person I could think of who might have advice, my girlfriend Alexis, who was a social worker and dealt with complicated family situations professionally. I told her everything, and she was silent for a long moment before saying, "You need to report this to the police. What your parents did is kidnapping. It's a serious crime. There are probably still active missing person cases and investigations. Carol Whitfield deserves to know what happened to her son, and your parents need to face consequences for what they did." I said, "They're my parents. I can't just turn them into the police." Alexis said, "They're not your parents. They're people who stole a child and lied to him for 23 years. You're a victim here, not a co-conspirator. You need to protect yourself, and you need to help Carol get justice." I spent the rest of that day in a fog, unable to focus on anything. I left work early and went back to my apartment, where I pulled out every family document I had: birth certificate, social security card, childhood photos, medical records. I looked at everything with new eyes, searching for evidence of the lie. My birth certificate listed Robert and Linda Chambers as my parents, birthplace listed as Denver, Colorado, date of birth May 15th, 1998. But if I'd been taken in March 2001 when I was 3, that would make my actual birth year 1998, which matched. The birth certificate was a complete fabrication. My social security card, my passport, my school records, all of it built on that false foundation. Every official document that said I was Daniel Chambers was part of an elaborate fraud that my parents had maintained for over 2 decades. That night, I called Carol back and asked her to tell me about Benjamin Whitfield. She said, "You were the sweetest little boy. You loved dinosaurs and construction trucks. You had this laugh that would just fill up a room. You were so smart and curious about everything. The day you disappeared, we'd gone to the playground like we did every Saturday. I turned my back for maybe 2 minutes to grab juice boxes from my bag, and when I looked up, you were gone. I screamed your name, searched everywhere, called 911. The police came, they searched for days, but there was no trace of you. No witnesses saw anything. It was like you'd vanished into thin air. I blamed myself every day. If I'd been paying closer attention, if I'd held your hand, if we'd stayed home that day. The guilt nearly destroyed me. My marriage fell apart. Your father and I divorced 2 years after you disappeared. I've spent 23 years wondering if you were alive, if you were scared, if you were hurt. And now I know you were alive all along, living with the people who took you. I asked Carol what she wanted to do with this information. She said, I want justice. I want those people prosecuted for what they did. But more than that, I want my son back. I want to know you. I want to rebuild some kind of relationship if that's possible. I know you don't remember me. I know you've lived your whole life thinking you're someone else. But you're my son, and I never stopped loving you. I told her I needed time to figure things out, that this was overwhelming and I didn't know what the right path forward was. She said she understood, but asked me not to take too long. She said, I've waited 23 years. I can wait a little longer, but not forever. At some point, we need to involve authorities and start the process of justice and healing. The next morning, I called a lawyer, not a criminal defense attorney, but a family law specialist named Richard Novak, who'd been recommended by Alexis. I explained the situation, and he was quiet for a long time before saying, This is one of the most unusual cases I've encountered. You're essentially a recovered missing child, but you're also an adult who's been living under a false identity. Your parents, the Chambers, committed multiple serious crimes including kidnapping, custodial interference, identity fraud, and potentially human trafficking, depending on how prosecutors choose to frame it. Carol Whitfield is your legal mother and has every right to report this to law enforcement. You also have rights as a victim. But this is going to get extremely complicated legally and emotionally. Richard recommended I contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the FBI, both of which handle cases of long-term missing children who are recovered. He said, This needs to be reported. The longer you wait, the more complicated it becomes. And honestly, you're potentially obstructing justice by knowing about a serious crime and not reporting it. I spent the next 2 days in paralysis, unable to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to protect the people who raised me, the parents who'd loved me and provided for me and gave me a good life. But part of me was furious at their deception, at the 23 years Carol had suffered, at the fundamental theft of my identity and my right to know who I really was. Finally, on Thursday morning, I made the decision. I called the Denver FBI field office and asked to speak to someone about a recovered missing child case. I was transferred to Special Agent Kristen Lawson, who'd been with the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit for 14 years. I told her the condensed version of the story, and she asked me to come to the field office immediately with any documentation I had. Agent Lawson reviewed everything: the DNA test results, my communications with Carol Whitfield, my birth certificate and other identity documents, photos from my childhood. She asked detailed questions about my memories from early childhood, about my parents' behavior over the years, about anything that might have seemed unusual looking back. Then she said, Based on what you've told me and the evidence you've provided, I'm opening a federal kidnapping investigation. I'll need to verify your story with Carol Whitfield and cross-reference with the original missing person case from 2001. I'll also need you to provide a formal statement and potentially testify. But I want you to understand that once this investigation is official, there's no going back. Your parents will likely be arrested and charged. Your entire life as Daniel Chambers will be revealed as fraud. There will be media attention. It will be traumatic and difficult. Are you prepared for that? I said I didn't know if I was prepared, but I knew it was the right thing to do. Agent Lawson said, I'm also going to connect you with a victim advocate named Julia Simmons, who specializes in recovered missing children and identity trauma. You're going to need psychological support through this. What you're experiencing is a form of trauma, even if your childhood was otherwise happy. The loss of identity and the betrayal by parental figures creates deep psychological wounds. Julia can help you process that. Over the next week, the investigation moved quickly. Agent Lawson verified my story with Carol Whitfield, who provided the original missing person reports, photos of Benjamin Whitfield as a toddler that matched my early childhood photos, and her own DNA sample for additional verification. She matched everything against federal databases and confirmed that I was indeed Benjamin Whitfield, reported missing from Tampa, Florida in March 2001. The case had gone cold after the first few years with no leads or evidence. Agent Lawson coordinated with Tampa Police Department and the Florida State Attorney's Office about charges. She also prepared arrest warrants for Robert and Linda Chambers on federal charges of kidnapping and state charges of custodial interference, child endangerment, and identity fraud. She asked if I wanted to be present when they were arrested. I said no. I couldn't watch that. On a Monday morning, exactly 2 weeks after I'd first discovered the DNA match, FBI agents and Denver police executed the arrest warrants at my parents' house. They were taken into custody without incident, processed, and held pending arraignment. I learned all this from Agent Lawson, who called me afterward to confirm it was done. She said, They didn't resist. Your mother, Linda, kept saying she was sorry and asking if you were okay. Your father, Robert, invoked his right to silence and requested an attorney. They're being held on high bail given the flight risk and the severity of the charges. The media picked up the story within hours. 23-year-old kidnapping case solved when victim discovers truth through DNA testing. The headlines were everywhere. Local news, national news, social media. Reporters started showing up at my apartment, at my workplace, trying to get comments. I had to take a leave of absence from my job and basically go into hiding. Julia Simmons, the victim advocate, helped me navigate the media circus and connected me with a therapist named Dr. Raymond Foster, who specialized in trauma and identity issues. Dr. Foster said, "What you're experiencing is complicated grief. You're grieving the loss of your identity as Daniel Chambers, grieving the loss of the parents you thought you had, grieving the childhood you thought you lived. At the same time, you're trying to integrate the reality that you're Benjamin Whitfield and that you have a biological mother who's been searching for you. Those two identities feel contradictory, and they're both true. That cognitive dissonance is painful and disorienting." 3 weeks after the arrests, Carol Whitfield flew to Denver to meet me in person. We arranged to meet at a quiet coffee shop with Julia Simmons present for support. I got there early and sat waiting, palms sweating, heart racing. When Carol walked in, I recognized her immediately from photos, even though we'd never met in my conscious memory. She was in her early 50s, with dark hair going gray and eyes that looked exactly like mine. She saw me, and her face crumpled. She walked over and said, "Oh my God, it's really you. You look so much like your father. Can I hug you?" I nodded, and she wrapped her arms around me and started crying. I stood there awkwardly, hugging a stranger who was technically my mother, feeling nothing but confusion and guilt and overwhelming sadness for what she'd been through. We sat down and talked for 2 hours. Carol told me about the life I'd had before I was taken, living in a small apartment in Tampa, going to a daycare I loved, being excited about becoming a big brother because she'd been pregnant when I was kidnapped. She said, "I lost the baby 2 months after you disappeared. The stress and grief caused a miscarriage, so I lost both my children that year." She told me about the years of searching, the false leads that went nowhere, the gradual acceptance that I was probably dead, the decision to finally try to move forward with her life. She said, "I never dated again, never had more children. I couldn't. Part of me died when you disappeared. I've just been going through the motions for 23 years, working as a nurse, volunteering with missing children organizations, existing, but not really living. And now you're here, and it's like a miracle, but also like reopening a wound that never really healed." I told Carol about my life as Daniel Chambers, the childhood I remembered, the parents who'd raised me, the career I'd built, the person I'd become. I tried to explain that while I understood intellectually that I was Benjamin Whitfield, I didn't feel like Benjamin. I felt like Daniel. That was the identity I'd lived in for 23 years. She said, "I understand. I'm not asking you to become someone you're not. I'm just asking for a chance to know you, whoever you are. We can build something new. You don't have to choose between being Benjamin and being Daniel. You can be both, or neither, or something entirely new. I just want to be part of your life if you'll let me." I said I'd try, but I couldn't make promises about what our relationship would look like. She said that was enough for now. The criminal case against Robert and Linda Chambers moved forward over the following months. They were indicted on federal kidnapping charges and multiple state charges. Their attorney tried to argue that they'd given me a good life, that I'd been happy and healthy, that their intentions had been loving even if their methods were illegal. The prosecutor, a federal attorney named David Keller, who'd prosecuted human trafficking and child exploitation cases for 12 years, shut that argument down hard. He said, "Intent doesn't matter when you steal a child." The Chambers traumatized Carol Whitfield, robbed her of her son, and deprived Benjamin Whitfield of his true identity and his biological family. They committed serious crimes motivated by their own desires, with no regard for the devastating consequences to their victims. They deserve significant prison time. Robert and Linda's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecution wasn't interested in leniency, given the severity and duration of the crime. The case went to trial 8 months after their arrest. I was called to testify, which was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I had to sit in a courtroom and describe my childhood, my relationship with the Chambers, the moment I discovered the truth, and the impact it had on my life. The defense attorney tried to paint me as a happy, well-adjusted adult who'd benefited from the Chambers' care. I had to push back and explain that the quality of care didn't justify the crime, that I'd lost 23 years with my biological mother, that my entire identity had been stolen, that I'd never have the chance to know my biological father who died in a car accident 5 years ago without ever knowing I was alive. Carol testified about the devastation of losing her child, the years of searching, the psychological toll. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged that the Chambers had provided material care but said, "This was not a victimless crime. This was a calculated, sustained campaign of deception that destroyed Carol Whitfield's life and robbed Benjamin Whitfield of his identity." The defendants showed no remorse until they were caught, and they obstructed justice by lying for 23 years. Robert Chambers was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Linda Chambers was sentenced to 12 years. Both were ordered to pay restitution to Carol for emotional damages, though no amount of money could compensate for what had been taken. After the sentencing, reporters swarmed. I made a brief statement saying I hoped my story would raise awareness about parental kidnapping and the long-term trauma it causes. Carol made a statement thanking law enforcement and asking for privacy as we worked to build a relationship. Rebuilding my life after everything fell apart was harder than I'd anticipated. I legally changed my name to Benjamin Daniel Whitfield, keeping both identities as a way of honoring both parts of my history. I moved to Portland to be closer to Carol and started the slow process of getting to know her as a person, not just as a biological mother. She introduced me to her side of the family, my aunts and uncles and cousins who'd grown up hearing about the nephew who'd disappeared. They welcomed me warmly, but I could see the grief and loss in their eyes. I represented 23 years of missed birthdays and holidays and milestones. My relationship with Alexis didn't survive the upheaval. She supported me through the initial crisis, but the media attention and the ongoing trauma of processing everything became too much. We ended things amicably 6 months after the arrests. Carol and I went to therapy together to work through our complicated relationship. Dr. Foster helped us navigate the unique challenges of reconnecting after forced separation. He said, "You can't get back the lost time, but you can build something new moving forward. Focus on who you both are now, not who you might have been if the kidnapping hadn't happened. That alternate timeline doesn't exist. This is your reality, and you get to decide what to make of it." Slowly, carefully, Carol and I built a relationship. It wasn't a traditional mother-son bond, but it was ours. She told me stories about my early childhood that I didn't remember. She showed me photos of myself as a baby and toddler that I'd never seen. She connected me to my biological father's family, who'd also mourned my disappearance. 2 years after the revelation, I'm still processing everything. I work as a graphic designer in Portland. I see Carol once or twice a week for dinner or coffee. I've built friendships and a life in a new city. I still think of myself as Daniel sometimes, especially in moments of stress or when I'm introduced to someone new and have to decide which name to use. The dual identity is something I'm learning to live with. I write letters to Robert and Linda sometimes, though I never send them. I don't know if I'll ever forgive them for what they did, but I'm trying to understand it. They were desperate for a child, and they made a terrible, selfish choice that destroyed multiple lives. They gave me material comfort and stability, but they stole something irreplaceable: my history, my family, my truth. Carol tells me she's grateful every day that I'm alive and that we found each other, even under these circumstances. She says, "I always knew you were out there somewhere. I felt it. And now you're here, and it's not the reunion I imagined, but it's real, and it's ours." I think about the life I might have had if I'd never been taken, growing up as Benjamin Whitfield in Florida, having a sibling, knowing my biological father before he died, living with the truth from the beginning. But that life doesn't exist. The life I have is the one I'm living now, built from the rubble of two contradictory identities. The biggest secret my family kept from me was that they weren't my family at all. And now I'm building a new family, one founded on truth instead of lies, one that honors both who I was and who I've become. It's not the story I thought I was living, but it's mine, and I'm learning to make peace with that. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.